Good morning and welcome. I'm Nestor Davidson, Chair of the New York City Rent Guidelines Board, and I'd like to welcome you to this meeting of the board. This is the first meeting in a series of public meetings and hearings to determine lease adjustments for rent-stabilized housing units in New York City, with leases commencing on or being renewed on or after October 1st, 2024, and on or before September 30th, 2025. I will now take roll call. Please respond if present. Doug Apple? Here. Genesis Aquino? Here. Christina DeRose? Robert Ehrlich?
Here.
Harvard Gupta? Here. Alex Schwartz? Here. Christina Smith? Here. Adon Soltren? And Nestor Davidson, I'm present. Let the record show that we have a quorum. And let me welcome back all of the members of the board, and thank you both for your service last year and in advance for your service this year. And as you know, I want to do at the beginning of our season, let me thank the staff of the Rent Guidelines Board, Andrew McLaughlin, Brian Hoberman, Danielle Berger, and Charmaine Superville. Their hard work year in and year out allows us to do our work, so thank you. The next planned meeting of this board will be here at the Landmarks Preservation Commission conference room on April 11th, starting at 9:30 a.m. Staff will be presenting the 2024 Income and Affordability Study. The public can also live stream our meetings via YouTube at youtube.com/Rent Guidelines Board. Information regarding this meeting will be posted on our website, nyc.gov/RGB, in our meetings section, and at the same time will be sent to those who are on our email list. If you are interested in receiving email updates about upcoming RGB meetings and hearings, please go to our homepage and click on RGB email updates under quick links. Today, staff will present the 2024 Income and Expense Study. A copy of the report is in your meeting folder. There are copies of this report here today, and it will be made available on our website after the meeting. A copy of the I&E presentation will also be posted on our website. Just click Research on our homepage to download these reports. In addition to the report, there are also non-public per diem forms in your folder. If you have any questions regarding these forms, please see Andrew. And note, please, that the annual Conflicts of Interest Board Financial Disclosure Report filing period begins on April 8th and will end on May 3rd. The COIB packets are here today. If you don't have the packet, please see Andrew as well after the meeting. After the staff presentation and board discussion of the I&E report, we'll hear from our guest speakers from the New York City Housing Preservation and Development, HPD, Associate Commissioner Lucy Jaffe, and Chief Research Officer Elizabeth Galmer. I will now introduce Brian Hoberman, the RGB Co-Research Director, who will be presenting the 2024 Income and Expense Study. Brian, please begin.
Thank you. Good morning. This report examines the conditions that existed in New York City's rent-stabilized housing market in 2022, the year for which the most recent data set is available, and the extent to which these conditions changed from 2021. In addition, the study stratifies buildings based on whether they were constructed prior to 1974, pre-74, or on or after January 1st, 1974, called post-73. With passage of the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974, buildings containing 6 or more residential units constructed prior to 74 are rent stabilized. However, apartment units in buildings constructed or extensively renovated after 1973 may be subject to rent stabilization only because the owner has agreed to receive tax benefits in exchange for entering the rent stabilization system. Finally, the study analyzes RPI data based on the proportion of stabilized units in buildings. Local Law 63 requires owners of apartment buildings to file RPI statements with the Department of Finance annually. While certain types of properties are exempt from filing RPIE forms, such as most residential-only buildings with fewer than 11 units, the mandate produces detailed financial information on thousands of buildings containing stabilized units. To ensure only buildings that contain stabilized units are analyzed, the DOF releases data to us only after matching RPIE data with building registration data from the Department of Homes and Community Renewal. The data used in this study includes 15,110 properties containing 102,010 units. This data is used to compute average revenue and cost for a moment in time view. We also conduct a longitudinal analysis of 13,751 buildings containing 642,881 units. This illustrates the change from 2021 to 2022 among the same set of buildings. In 2022, rent-stabilized property owners collected monthly rent averaging $1,578 per unit per month. The median rent citywide in 2022 was $1,322. Units in buildings constructed before 1974 rented for less on average at $1,418 per month than those in buildings constructed after 1973, $2,267. At the borough level, the average monthly rent in buildings containing stabilized units was $2,135 in Manhattan, at $2,677 in Core Manhattan, and $1,394 in Upper Manhattan, $1,526 in Brooklyn, $1,502 in Queens, $1,086 in the Bronx, and $1,033 on Staten Island. Average monthly rent per unit in the city, excluding Core Manhattan, was $1,354. Many building owners supplement income from their apartment rents by selling services as well as by renting commercial space. In 2022, building owners in New York City earned an average gross income of $1,769 per unit. The citywide median income was $1,439. Pre-74 buildings earned $1,587 per unit, and those in post-73 properties earned $2,552 per unit. Income was highest in Manhattan at $2,498 per unit per month. In Core Manhattan, it was $3,118 and $1,649 in Upper Manhattan. In the remainder of the city, Brooklyn's gross income was $1,640, followed by Queens at $1,603, the Bronx at $1,224, and Staten Island at $1,166. Monthly income per unit in the city, excluding Core Manhattan, was $1,488. This graph shows that average monthly income and rent were the highest in Core Manhattan and the lowest it's in Staten Island. Average income is in red and average rent in blue. And as in this graph and all other graphs in the presentation are also in the report itself, if you'd like to consult it further. Gross income encompasses all revenue from rent, including apartment rent, commercial rent, such as retail space and cell phone towers, sales of services such as laundry, parking, and vending, and all other operating income. The sale of services and commercial income accounted for 10.8% of the total income earned by building owners in 2022 citywide, up a half a percentage point from the prior year's 10.3. By borough, income earned from services and commercial rents as a percentage of total building income was 14.5% in Manhattan, it was 15.5% in Upper Manhattan, and 14.1% in Core Manhattan. It was 11.4% in Staten Island, 11.3% in the Bronx, 7% in Brooklyn, and 6.3% in Queens. In the city, excluding Core Manhattan, the proportion was 9%. The average monthly O&M cost for units was $1,164 in 2022. Median monthly cost was $1,027. Costs were lower in units in pre-74 structures at $1,137 and higher among post-73 buildings at $1,282. By borough, average costs were highest in Manhattan at $1,636. Within Manhattan, costs for units located in Core Manhattan were higher, averaging $1,977 a month, while the costs in Upper Manhattan were $1,170. Elsewhere, costs in Queens were $1,071, Brooklyn $984, the Bronx $892, and Staten Island $835. Excluding Core Manhattan, the average monthly operating cost for stabilized building owners in New York City was $999. For a second year, the income and expense study makes cost adjustments as a replacement for an outdated audit that was traditionally used to adjust expenses. This year's cost adjustment reduces expenses by 4.41%. The adjustment is based on calculating the difference in average expenses among data sets both with and without Department of Finance assessment adjustments. Note that adjustments to expenses are only made in a few specific parts of the report and are clearly cited as adjusted expenses. Adjustment of the 2022 RPIE O&M cost of $11.64 by the results of this year's cost adjustment results in an average O&M cost of $11.13. Just as buildings without commercial space typically generate less revenue on a per unit basis than stabilized properties with commercial space, operating expenses in these buildings tend to be lower on average than in buildings with a mixture of uses. In 2022, average adjusted O&M costs for residential-only buildings was $1,045 per month. Residential-only buildings therefore have an average adjusted O&M costs that are 10.2% lower than all buildings. This graph breaks down expenses by component and further splits them into pre-74 and post-73 categories. The largest share of expenses went towards taxes, followed by maintenance and administrative costs. Post-73 buildings, indicated in this graph in blue, spent more on maintenance, administration, labor, utilities, and miscellaneous costs. Pre-74 buildings, shown in red, spent more on taxes, fuel, and insurance. The average expenses per unit per month for all buildings is shown in yellow. Buildings where total operating and maintenance costs exceed gross income are defined as distressed. In 2022, 9.8% of buildings were considered distressed. That was 1 percentage point higher than the prior year's 8.8%. By borough, 44.3% of distressed buildings are in Manhattan, while the remaining are in the Bronx with 27.1%, Brooklyn 17.6%, Queens 10.6%, and Staten Island with 0.4%. Since 1990, when 13.9% of stabilized properties were considered distressed, the proportion of distressed buildings has declined to as low as 4.9% in 2016. However, the proportion of distressed properties has since risen in each of the last 6 years to the most recent 9.8%, which is the highest level since 2009. Revenues exceed operating costs in nearly all buildings, yielding funds that could be used for mortgage payments, capital improvements, and/or pre-tax profit. The amount of income remaining after O&M expenses are paid is typically referred to as net operating income. In 2022, apartments and buildings containing stabilized units generated $605 of NOI per month, with units in post-73 buildings earning more, $1,270 per month, than those in pre-74 buildings, $450 per month. Average monthly NOI in residential-only properties citywide was $522 per unit, 13.7% lower than the average for all buildings containing stabilized units. In 2022, average NOI was significantly different by borough. Average monthly per unit NOI is greater among stabilized properties in Manhattan at $861. It was a notable difference when looking at NOI on a subborough level in Manhattan. Core Manhattan properties earned an average of $1141 per unit per month in NOI, 138% greater than properties in Upper Manhattan, which earned an average NOI of $479. Elsewhere, NOI was $657 in Brooklyn, $532 in Queens, $332 in the Bronx, and $331 in Staten Island. The monthly NOI average calculated citywide, excluding Core Manhattan, was $489. Another way to evaluate the financial condition of buildings that contain stabilized units is by measuring the ratio of expenses to revenues. Using the expense adjustment method, the expense-adjusted cost-income ratio in 2022 was 62.9%. That means that on average, owners of rent-stabilized properties spent roughly 62.9 cents out of every dollar on O&M costs in 2022. Looking at unadjusted operating expenses, the cost-income ratio was 65.8. Rent, income, and cost per unit were on average highest in Core Manhattan in 2022, which is shown in the left graph. Outside Core Manhattan, average revenue and cost figures are lower and have different expense to revenue ratios. In 2022, the adjusted cost-income ratio in the city outside Core Manhattan was 64.2%, about 3.5 percentage points higher than the adjusted cost-income ratio for buildings in Manhattan's core, which was 60.6%. This graph shows the inflation-adjusted change citywide in income, rent, expenses, and NOI over a period of over 3 decades. Between 1990 and 2022, income, which is the red line at the top, cumulatively increased at an inflation-adjusted 39.8%. Rent, which is the second line from the top, in yellow, rose 40.1%. Costs, the third line in blue, grew 36.1%, and net operating income, represented by the bottom line in peach, increased by 48.4%. These graphs represent the same period as the graphs on the last slide, but break it down by borough. It shows that while the actual inflation-adjusted income, rent, cost, and NOI figures are far higher in Manhattan, the percentage increase in NOI since 1990 in Manhattan was actually the lowest among the boroughs. Brooklyn, at the top right, saw the largest NOI increase over this period, with NOI rising 153%. Queens, at the bottom left, experienced the second largest growth in NOI, rising 63%. The Bronx, at the bottom right, saw NOI increase 37%. And finally, in Manhattan, shown in the top left graph, inflation-adjusted NOI grew 35% since 1990. Staten Island is not included over this period because of too few buildings. We will now move to the second part of the I&E study, which is the longitudinal analysis. The longitudinal sample encompasses properties that filed RPI forms reflecting conditions in both 2021 and 2022. By conducting the longitudinal analysis, we can more accurately track changes from year to year as the same buildings are being analyzed. Average rent collections in buildings containing stabilized units rose by 7.4% from 2021 to 2022. Rent collections in post-73 buildings rose at a greater rate, up 12.6%, while rent among pre-74 buildings grew by 5.5%. By building size, rent collections on average rose the most among large 100-plus unit buildings, up 10.4%, followed by 11 to 19 unit buildings growing 6.7%, and mid-sized 20 to 99 unit buildings increasing 5.1%. Looking at rent collections throughout the city, all but 3 community districts saw an increase in average rent from 2021 to 2022. At the neighborhood level, the largest increases in rent collections citywide occurred in 7 Manhattan neighborhoods, including the Village, up 16.3%, and Stuytown Turtle Bay, up 15.9%. The largest increase in Brooklyn occurred in Williamsburg Greenpoint, up 10.9%. The Queens neighborhood seeing the largest increase was Middle Village Ridgewood, up 8.6%, while the largest increase in the Bronx was in Marsania, Melrose, Claremont, up 3.9%. However, the 3 districts to see a decline in average collected rent were all located in the Bronx. East Tremont, Belmont, down 5.8%, Williamsbridge, Baychester, down 1.7%, and Kingsbridge Heights, Moshulu, Norwood, down 1.5%. A list of all the neighborhoods and how much their rent changed can be found in the report in Appendix 13. Examining rent collections by borough, they increased the most in Manhattan, up 12.5%. Within Manhattan, core Manhattan rents rose more, up 15%, while upper Manhattan rents increased 6.4%. Elsewhere, rent increased 6.6% in Brooklyn, 5.3% in Queens, 3.3% in Staten Island, and 0.6% in the Bronx. Rent collection in the city, excluding core Manhattan, increased 4.6%, and median rent citywide also increased 4.6%. The average total income collected in buildings containing stabilized units, comprising apartment rents, commercial rents, and sale of services, rose 7.6% citywide from 2021 to 2022. Revenues grew more in post-73 buildings, up 12.4%, than among pre-74 buildings, up 5.8%. Around the city, income grew the most in Manhattan, rising 12.3%. Within Manhattan, core Manhattan income rose 15%, and upper Manhattan income increased 6.1%. In the rest of the city, income in Brooklyn was up 6.8%, Queens was up 5.2%, Staten Island up 2.7%, and the Bronx up 1.3%. Total income in the city, excluding core Manhattan, rose 4.8%, and median income citywide rose 5%. Citywide, average expenses in buildings containing stabilized units rose 6.1% from 2021 to 2022. Pre-74 buildings saw a larger increase in expenses, up 6.6%, while post-73 buildings experienced a 4.4% increase in expenses. By borough, costs grew the most in the Bronx, up 8.9%, followed by Staten Island, up 8.3%, Queens, up 7.7%, Brooklyn, up 5.7%, and Manhattan, up 4.4%. Within Manhattan, Upper Manhattan costs grew more, rising 6.8%, while costs grew 3.3% in core Manhattan. Operating costs in the city, excluding core Manhattan, rose by 7.3%. Meanwhile, median citywide expenses grew by 7.1%. It can be useful to compare the cost changes calculated from RPI data with the price and cost data from the Price Index of Operating Costs, which has been adjusted to match time periods between the two. The adjusted PIOC is in blue, while the RPI data is in red. As the graph shows, the data grew at varying rates compared to the price index. In the most recent year, the PIOC grew by 7.1% from 2021 to 2022, the same period as a 6.1% increase in RPIE expenses. Net operating income refers to the earnings that remain after O&M expenses are paid, but before payment of income tax, capital improvements, and debt service. Citywide longitudinal NOI in buildings containing stabilized units grew by 10.4% from calendar year 2021 to 2022. This contrasts with the decline in NOI in the prior year when it fell 9.1%. Citywide, NOI in post-73 buildings climbed 20.9%, while in older pre-74 buildings it grew by 4.1%. However, the average change in NOI from 2021 to 2022 varied throughout the city. NOI increased the most in Manhattan, up 30.6%. Within Manhattan, NOI grew 42.3% in core Manhattan and 4.6% in upper Manhattan. In the remainder of the city, Brooklyn grew 8.3% and Queens was up 0.6%. By contrast, NOI fell 14% in the Bronx and 9.3% in Staten Island. Monthly NOI in the city, excluding core Manhattan, increased 0.3%. Examining only pre-74 buildings, NOI citywide rose 4.1%. In Manhattan, NOI increased 29.4%. Within Manhattan, NOI rose 48.2% in core Manhattan, but fell 0.7% in upper Manhattan. In the remainder of the city, Staten Island rose 1.6%, but Brooklyn fell 0.8%, Queens was down 5.5%, and the Bronx declined 18.5%. Monthly NOI in the city, excluding core Manhattan, was down 7%. At the community district level, the NOI increased in 43% of city's neighborhoods. The largest increases occurred in 9 Manhattan neighborhoods, including Midtown, up 79.3%, and the Village, up 52.7%. The largest increase in Brooklyn was in Williamsburg, Greenpoint, rising 19.8%, and the largest increase in Queens was in Middle Village, Ridgewood, up 12.4%. By contrast, NOI fell in 57% of the city's neighborhoods, including all of the Bronx. The largest decline occurred in 7 Bronx neighborhoods, including Kingsbridge Heights, Moshulu, Norwood, down 22.5%, and Williamsbridge, Baychester, down 21.5%. The Brooklyn neighborhood seeing the largest decline was Flatlands, Canarsie, down 14.6%, while in Queens, the largest decline was in Flushing, Whitestone, down 13.1%. In Manhattan, the only neighborhood seeing a decline was Washington Heights, Inwood, falling 8.8%, and on Staten Island, the North Shore fell 2.6%. As with the rent data by district, a list of all the neighborhoods and how much NOI has changed can be found in the appendix in Appendix 13. Until this point, the study has examined buildings that contain at least one rent-stabilized unit. In recent years, RGB board members have asked RGB staff to also examine buildings based on the proportion of stabilized units in buildings. The RGB requested that the Department of Finance prepare supplemental data for buildings that contain at least 50% stabilized units, at least 80% stabilized units, and 100% stabilized units. That is, all residential units are stabilized in a building. And we prepared the following analysis. Citywide, half the buildings that contain at least one stabilized unit are 100% stabilized. However, there is a sizable difference when comparing core Manhattan to the other parts of the city. Buildings that are entirely rent stabilized comprise 61% of buildings containing at least one stabilized unit in the city, excluding core Manhattan, compared to 16% in core Manhattan alone. Average rent, income, cost, and NOI vary widely between post-73 and pre-74 buildings, as well as based on the proportion of stabilized units in a building. For example, looking at 100% stabilized buildings in core Manhattan, NOI is $810 in pre-74 buildings compared to $1,335 among post-73 buildings. By comparison, among 100% stabilized buildings in the remainder of the city, NOI is $343 in pre-74 buildings compared to $1,048 among post-73 buildings. Adjusted cost-income ratios can also be examined based on a building's proportion of stabilized units, as well as its location. As noted earlier, the adjusted cost-income ratio citywide among all buildings is 62.9%. Looking solely at pre-74 buildings, the ratio for all building is 68.5% citywide, 64.8% in core Manhattan, and 70.1% in the rest of the city. Looking at pre-74 buildings with differing proportions of stabilized units, among 50% plus stabilized buildings, the citywide ratio rises to 68.6%, with a ratio of 62.1% in core Manhattan and 70.1% in the remainder of the city. Among pre-74 80% plus stabilized buildings, the citywide ratio falls to 68.2%, with a ratio of 56.1% in core Manhattan and 69.8% in the rest of the city. And among pre-74 100% stabilized buildings, the citywide ratio rises to 69%, with a ratio of 58.5% in core Manhattan and 70.3% elsewhere in the city. Looking at change in NOI from 2021 to 2022 among 100% stabilized buildings of all ages, it rose 1.8% citywide. In core Manhattan, NOI rose 34.1%, but in the rest of the city, NOI fell 1.4%. Among 100% stabilized pre-74 buildings, NOI fell 4.5% citywide. It rose 50.2% in core Manhattan and fell 8% in the city outside of core Manhattan. As discussed earlier, buildings that have O&M costs that exceed gross income are considered distressed. Examining pre-74 buildings that contain differing proportions of stabilized units, the study found a higher proportion of distressed properties in core Manhattan in each category. Among pre-74 buildings containing 50% or more stabilized units, 11.3% of buildings in core Manhattan were distressed, compared to 9.3% elsewhere in the city. Looking at pre-74 buildings with 80% or more stabilized units, 12.1% of core Manhattan were distressed, while 9.6% were elsewhere in the city. And for entirely stabilized pre-74 buildings, 12.2% of core Manhattan buildings were distressed, while 9.6% were distressed elsewhere in the city. So, to sum up this year's income and expense study, in 2022, citywide average monthly collected rent per unit was $1,578, average income was $1,769, average operating costs were $1,164, and average NOI was $605 per unit per month. The proportion of distressed properties rose from the prior year by 1 percentage point to 9.9%. The adjusted cost-income ratio citywide in 2022 was 62.9%. In core Manhattan, the ratio was 60.6%, roughly 3.5 percentage points lower than the city excluding core Manhattan at 64.2%. Looking solely at pre-74 buildings, the ratio for all buildings is 68.5% citywide. It was 64.8% in core Manhattan and 70.1% in the remainder of the city. Longitudinally, from 2021 to 2022, rental income increased an average of 7.4%, total income grew an average of 7.6%, and operating costs rose an average of 6.1%. Net operating income increased 10.4% for buildings containing stabilized units. It was the first increase in NOI in 3 years. The growth in NOI citywide was driven by core Manhattan, where it rose 42.3%. NOI in the remainder of the city rose 0.3% over the same period. Examining only pre-74 buildings, NOI citywide rose 4.1%. It climbed 48.2% in core Manhattan, but fell 7% in the remainder of the city. And finally, summing up buildings that are 100% or entirely stabilized, pre-74 adjusted cost-income ratio citywide was 69%. It was 58.5% in core Manhattan and 70.3% in the remainder of the city. The pre-74 distress proportion in citywide was 9.8%. In core Manhattan, it was 12.2%. And in the city outside of the core Manhattan was 9.6%. And for 100% stabilized buildings of all ages, NOI citywide was up 1.8%. In core Manhattan, it was up 34.1%, but NOI in the remainder of the city fell 1.4%. Thank you. I will now take any questions you may have.
Thank you so much. Let me, while folks are getting organized, let me just ask one question about the kind of geographic and sort of unit type analysis. One of the things that your report, the staff's report underscores
Thank you.
is the difference between taking a citywide kind of average versus breaking this down by age and by geography, as we now can do, and certainly appreciate that. Does anything in the report give us any insight into particularly what's happening in the Bronx, particularly with the older buildings, and you look at the cost, you look at the income, and the total drop in net operating income? It's obviously distinct from, and again, we're bracketing, I think we can bracket core Manhattan as its own dynamic, but even thinking about the Queens and Brooklyn and the Bronx seems to present a different story, and I'm wondering what the data might suggest about what's happening in that part of the portfolio.
Yeah, it's broken down, pretty extensively in the appendix. Bronx, compared to the other boroughs, had a lower increase in income and a higher increase in costs, so that's pretty much driving that borough. And the NOI obviously went down the most in the Bronx, and you can see that in Bronx-wide, and you can see it in all the community districts, how they're broken out in the appendix as well.
I actually just want to follow up on this exact point. So if I'm looking at Appendix Table 21, for instance, those are the longitudinal analyses, the rents, the incomes, costs, and NOI changes by pre-1974 buildings. And so if I look at the Bronx there, it seems like the rents and the incomes are lower compared to the rest of the city, as you were saying, but the costs are also higher. So they average around 9%. While the citywide average is more like 6 or 7%. So do we know what cost categories are driving the increase for the Bronx specifically with these pre-1974 buildings?
From this report, from the data, we cannot ascertain the reason. Andrew might have some idea from the price index. I don't know if you have anything to share. Insurance, I know I've heard is higher, going up higher in the Bronx, but I'm not sure if I know anything else. Andrew, do you have any?
Yeah, we may have a little bit more detail when we talk about the price index. But in terms of this table, it's all collected rent and collected income. So it's not income, it's not rent that's charged or contract rent, it's collected rent. So that's some of the issue of driving, so throughout the report it's that way, it's all collected rent and income. But the expenses are owner-reported expenses, what's going on there. So, just to clarify that.
So, if it's based on collected rent, then how does ERAP, which was a big portion of the collected rent for 2021, 2022, how does that play into these numbers?
I think if it was collected in that period, it would be measured in this.
Right, but isn't that like an artificial number? I mean, it's not as if the tenants are paying that rent. That is coming from an independent third party that is,
It's possible that the owners didn't report it. I'm not really sure exactly, I can't ascertain what they did, but I would think it should be included, but I can't confirm that.
So, some of the ERAP was 2021, was that right?
the program started, I think, in 2021, but it also came into, I mean, it really starts,
2020.
it was 2022 was really the big window. You know, it started towards it was middle of 2021, but 2022 was a majority, and applications went through, I think, January of 2023 is when the portal shut down, although the portal is still open now, kind of, maybe minimally, something of the sort, but, yeah.
And Brian, just to clarify on this point, reported income includes vouchers, includes any other source of income?
To my knowledge, it should include any kind of income
Okay.
that's collected during this calendar year, but,
Yeah,
like I said, how owners reported, I can't confirm.
As far as we know, that it should be in there. The ERAP money should be in there. That's our understanding, finance, but we could go back and double check that. But that's my understanding.
Do we know when ERAP wound down in terms of when people stopped receiving ERAP or landlords? It's okay. Is it still very striking that the income is so much less, in the Bronx? And, if arrears has increased even more, I don't know if there's data on arrears by borough or proxies for that, because it is very striking that income is, going up so much less, or, in the Bronx compared to other boroughs, as well as NY operating costs have increased more. I have one other question. In terms of the distressed buildings, it's noted that Manhattan has a disproportionate share. Can you tell us the overall share of Manhattan of all rent-stabilized housing so we can compare that? I didn't see those breakdowns.
Distressed. I mean, we do have all of Manhattan. The percentage, I don't know if I have it calculated, but you can,
Yeah, if you, in Appendix 9, so there was 6,000, in this study, there's 6,003 buildings in Manhattan. No, that are total buildings in the study, and the amount of Manhattan distressed buildings, if you go to Appendix 7, the total number in Manhattan was 655.
it's pretty closely divided, evenly divided almost between core and upper, but,
Just to remind us, this isn't the entire portfolio, but this is the sample.
yeah, it includes about 15,000 buildings total.
Yeah, I just had a comment and then a quick question. So as for the insurance cost, I just want to note that if you look at the table on page 8, it is the second lowest cost associated with, or expense rather. I know last year it was made to be a large concern in terms of the percentage increase, but in reality what we're seeing is that it only increased by a few dollars, I believe, from last year per unit. The other thing that I would just note, or actually the question I was going to ask, Brian, do we have data or can we get data about owners who own at least one building rent stabilized building in core Manhattan that also own buildings in outer boroughs? And if so, how would we get that data?
Yeah, we don't know who owns these buildings. This is all, an aggregated numbers that we get, so we don't even know what particular buildings are in each of these categories. So it would be tough for us. It would be impossible for us to compare this based on ownership.
I just wonder, would HDR have information that would be, insightful?
Wait, to Brian's point, we couldn't get it from this data, I'm thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, we went through this whole process of 2 years ago trying to figure out ownership of building. So I'm not going to say yes or no. Let me look into it. But I don't think we can get to that. But let me see if we can.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, it's no surprise that I'm going to be highlighting the fact that NOI is up massively, like a 10.4% jump, when it's a flip from seeing a 9% decrease from last year, right? But I think it would be disingenuous, right, if some of the same owners who are operating and benefiting greatly off of these core Manhattan buildings also are owners of outer borough buildings in the Bronx, where they're maybe not putting additional expenses there. That's
Brian, can I just ask really a methodological question? You adjust expenses downward by, I think it's 4.41%.
Just in a few cases, only when
Right.
it's noted.
But can you talk about the methodology that you use to do that? You mentioned about dropping certain
Yeah.
records for some
Right,
reasons.
we get the main RPA data set, which includes all the buildings.
Right.
That contain stabilized units. We also asked Department of Finance beginning last year, for last year's report, to generate the same data for buildings that don't have any expense adjustments. In other words, there's a subset of buildings that Department of Finance does not have to make any expense adjustments, that they're exactly as reported by owners.
Right.
So we take the difference in expenses between the main data set and the data set of
Adjusted.
buildings that have no expense adjustment, assuming those, are accurate. And the difference between that is about 4.41%.
And do you know how many buildings are in that adjusted set? And the reason that they're in that data set? Like,
Well, they're there because Department of Finance did not make any expense adjustments to their data.
but how do they determine the need for an adjustment?
I
They
mean,
just look for outliers, saying like
think-
these look
Yeah.
crazy high or
Yeah.
crazy low?
So they have, I believe it's 10% below the 10th percentile and above the 90th. They look
Got
at
it.
those and
So
then.
anybody that's outside that.
Right, so then they bring in those
range.
expenses, and they do it on the income side too, with the income and expense. So this is all about assessing building,
Yeah, no.
and that's what they do. We should say that up front. So when they go to make their assessments, they're trying to assess it on a building where they have what they think are accurate expenses and income. And they'll do it by whatever location. So they'll take, by tax class. So if it's a 5-story walk-up in multifamily
divide it up
in,
by geography
the
and
village,
tax
then they
class.
look at those buildings and that norm, and then they,
Each class of
And
buildings.
so they make those changes. So what the idea behind the methodology is to say, well, this is what the owners had reported where they were above all that, and so we come with a reduction.
there are approximately 5,200 buildings that do not have any expense adjustment made.
That do not have any. So only a third of the buildings in the data set don't get adjusted?
Apparently, yes.
Interesting. So that means 2/3 or something that finance found to be either outside that normal range.
Right.
So they can't do it on a stratified basis because you wouldn't have 2/3.
No, but
I'm just curious.
right,
Maybe
but
it's
in
separate.
fairness, it's not to say that the expense didn't happen. In some cases, that may be it.
Right.
But they're saying this is a normal expense. So if they have an unusual expense goes up for whatever reason, and it shouldn't be capital expense, but other
Right,
expense
no.
for what that is, the expense could be legit, but they're assessing the actual bill.
Okay, thank you.
Really quickly, well, let me address this point, because Doug, you just asked your question. I appreciate, Brian, and obviously the folks at RGB, the painstaking sort of detail you get into and the work that you put in. I will, again, note, as I did the last few years, and it's actually brought up again in this report, that the information provided here is still not a perfect substitute for an audit. And so my ask would be for a future, on the agenda for a future meeting, perhaps next meeting or the one after, actually adding that conversation to the agenda to determine whether or not we can come to some consensus as to what needs to happen, or what could happen, or what's within the realm of possibility. So that's the first thing I would like to say. And then the second note, I wanted to just point out something from Alex's question about distressed buildings. And actually, I have a question about this. So on the graph from page 9, where we see the share of the distressed property is increasing. Is the 1990 date, because that's when we started getting information about the RPI?
Right.
Okay.
Anytime we go back, it's, yeah, that's when we received a substantial amount of data, and so we use the 1990 as the starting point.
So I just want to note from that, right, like you can see the stark decrease, right? So prior to 1990, the inference there would be that this is a higher number of distressed buildings, right? And the second thing I'd like to note is that even at the number that it's at, the 9.8, it's still within, if you were to take the historical average from 90 to 22, it's still just in the middle, right? And if you actually take into consideration the fact that it was probably worse, like that number was higher prior to 90, it would be below the historical average. And the difference from last year to this year isn't as significant. So I just want to, not to say that this is something that is not a concern, but still putting it into additional context.
Other questions, comments? Christine?
Yeah, so the last slide describes NOI citywide up 1.8%, but NOI in the remainder of the city outside core Manhattan fell by 1.4%. So just a point of information to Adon's comment about a massive increase in NOI data. The last slide is the remainder in the city fell by 1.4.
This is among 100% stabilized.
Among 100% stabilized, which, if we look,
Yeah, am I correct that this is, the findings this year are sort of the reverse of last year? If I remember, last year it was the Manhattan buildings that suffered the biggest losses of NOI, and the ones that, the more stable, the buildings with higher percentages of stabilized units, especially outside core Manhattan, actually showed more resilience last year, whereas this year, those are the buildings that are suffering the most in terms of loss of NOI. Is that correct?
I mean, yeah, essentially Manhattan last year saw the biggest decline, and then it reversed this year essentially. And the other, outside the city, you haven't seen the dip. You didn't see the shift as much
And also,
over
though,
2
in
years.
terms of the percentage of rent stabilized units, if I remember correctly, last year, there was more stability among those buildings in terms of NOI compared to this year?
I don't remember offhand. I can take a look. I have to look at last year's report.
I just had a couple additional questions.
Yeah, go ahead, I'll pull up last year's.
So Brian, I wanted to know, when was the last time we had a jump in NOI that was greater than 2%?
Well, I mean, we have the change in NOI on a table that goes all the way back to 1990 on page 20.
Page 20?
Yeah, so that,
Okay.
so every year's there, except for 1 year where we didn't have, the data was not available.
I'm sorry, that was on page 20, you said?
Mm-hmm.
It's that last column.
Thank you.
We-
So,
yeah.
No, go ahead, Brian. And so, by my count, it's only, what? It's only, this is the fourth time in the last 32 years that it's increased that high, right? Because I see here.
We mentioned it declined 5 times, but yeah, we don't, the
What I'm
report.
seeing is 96, right, 97, there was 11.4, 11.8, and then now 2014, 2015, and that was 10.8. And so for that year, the rental adjustment, the most recent plus 10 increase, right, from 2014, 2015, the corresponding year's rental adjustment from the guidelines board would have been 2017, right? Because it would be 2 years after.
I'm sorry, for which year are you looking
So
at?
if we're looking at the most recent 10+% jump in average NOI growth, that would be 2014, 2015, right?
Right.
And so the the corresponding RGB adjustment.
It would be 2 years earlier, yeah.
2 years later, right?
Well, the data from 20, I mean, this is the year, so it would be that year. I'm sorry. The
Right, so I guess-
report is
2017
comes out
would
2
be
years
the
after this data.
Right, so the 2017 adjustment would be that year, and that year's adjustment on a 1 year was 1.25%, which is less than half of last year. So I'm just putting this into additional context, right? So, okay, just so I'm sure I'm understanding this correctly, that the last time there was a 10+ jump in NOI, the adjustment was 1.25% on the one.
I mean, you can also look, the table on page 7 also is useful because it shows the rent growth at least, not the NOI, over the years in 3 different methods of adjusting or accounting for the rent growth.
Kind of on that, because I think it looks like in the data, Core Manhattan has a huge impact on those numbers.
I mean, it did this year because it jumped up so much essentially.
Exactly, and so could you run that column, like the average NOI growth since 1990?
Oh, no.
Separately without Core Manhattan? Be curious to see what that looked like.
This data, well, I don't think we couldn't do the rent index or HCR rent growth.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking at the last column, the NOI.
Oh.
Page 12, I think that's the student extent, breaks out NOI.
Oh, over time, sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Right, the page 12 is inflation adjusted change. Other than here, we don't really do inflation adjustments over this 32-year period.
And it's interesting in that regard, looking at the cumulative NOI, Manhattan versus non, and this doesn't break out for Manhattan versus
Right.
Upper Manhattan,
Right.
but Manhattan as a whole had the smallest total increase in NOI.
Right.
I don't know what that tells you about the variability.
Yeah, it means that, yeah, and part of it is the distortion of COVID, right? The last couple of years was so unusual.
So I'm not sure that we can look at 21 to 22 without getting the ERAP numbers somehow, because I believe it's a one-time phenomenon. There were, tenants who were chronically in arrears who got 15 months of rent paid that otherwise probably wouldn't have gotten paid and would have sat in a money judgment. We're thankful for ERAP, of course, but the increase, we're looking at a consistent decline, but for an anomaly in 18, but 19, 20 down 7.8, 21, 20 to 21 down 9.1, and then suddenly when there's a huge influx of funds that would have never been received by these owners, from the government, I think the ERAP numbers as compared to income overall for this particular session, I think is really crucial that we have that data.
And I know the staff looked at this last year, I wonder what data we have on that, certainly.
I guess my question, just for clarification, Christina, are you asking whether or not, are you saying that the ERAP funds contributed to the large increase in Core Manhattan specifically in terms of the rent?
In general, I would say across the 5 boroughs,
The
the
reason why-
impact of ERAP. Potentially more in Core Manhattan because access to information, potentially, more resources, Core Manhattan, it's impossible to say, but again, we're now into 23, 24. I think we're going to be back into negative NOI without that influx.
So I hear that. I guess at the point I think someone on the side of the table was making earlier was in terms of like when we look at vouchers, right, and we look at that source of income, it's still income, A, but B, last year there was the whole narrative about, or what I see from last year, I'll say, is that there was all of that flight that happened out of Core Manhattan, right, and then we're seeing exactly what I think some of us predicted, that now folks have come back in, asking rents, and rents are going up, and landlords are benefiting hand over fist because of that. So while I hear what you're saying, and certainly I welcome like whatever additional information and data that we have about ERAP, like I don't necessarily fully weight or understand the points that you're making, considering it is still the income, particularly in those in core Manhattan. But
Yep.
Arpit, please.
So I was going to ask about the comparison between page 9 and page 27. So page 9 shows the share of distressed properties increasing, and then 27 breaks that out by borough. So you see the largest number of distressed buildings in Manhattan. But from everything else we've been discussing, Manhattan has had very high NOI growth. So I'm wondering where the change in distressed buildings is coming from, right? So one graph shows the time trend, one graph shows it by borough, but I'm wondering what has changed by borough in terms of the number of distressed buildings. Is that also coming from Manhattan, which again would be strange given the NOI growth, or is it coming from the other boroughs?
I can't say without looking more closely at the data how that's changed, but I can look into that.
All right, any other comments or questions?
I found it.
Good job, Andrew. All right.
So,
They can detect the.
so to answer, I think it was Alex. So, if this is for all buildings, meaning that there's at least one stabilized unit, but what we saw citywide was a drop in the NOI of 9.1%. The drop in NOI for the Bronx, for example, was 1.9, Brooklyn 2.8, Manhattan 19.1, Queens 6.3, and then particularly in core Manhattan and upper Manhattan, it was 21% decline in NOI, and upper Manhattan 14.8. So there was decline really everywhere in NOI. There's been a rebound clearly in Manhattan, driven predominantly by core Manhattan, particularly post 73. And I think some of that is also, I think there was probably more vacant stabilized units during the pandemic in core Manhattan. So when they came back, you're seeing growth in income there because that's a vacant unit that's now full. So I think that's probably part of the explanation of what's going on this year in core Manhattan. But there were some other like parts of Brooklyn we covered in NOI. So there was some. So it's a little mixed on the outer side of it in terms of recovery. But for example, the Bronx is worse in NOI drop this year.
Brian, thank you again.
Okay.
And we
Thank you.
With follow-up questions, we can circle back after.
Thank you.
Thank you. We'll now hear a presentation from HPD. And if we could invite our colleagues from HPD, I'll introduce them. We have a presentation. So we'd like to welcome, as I mentioned before, Lucy Joffe, Associate Commissioner for Housing Policy, and Elizabeth Gaumer, HPD's Chief Research Officer. Welcome, and thank you so much for being here and for sharing your insights. And we have copies of the presentation. Great, thank you. Give us a moment, we'll get that around.
Is it the HPD HVS tour? Is that right? Where's stuff?
Sold out.
It's sold out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Is that working? Yes? Okay. We've heard some commentary that on the live streaming, the sound has been a little low, so I'm going to try to talk directly into this. All right. Good morning, everyone. Let me make sure I can, yes, I can even navigate this. Okay. Good morning. I am Elizabeth Gaumer. I serve as Chief Research Officer at the New York City Department of Housing Preservation and Development, or HPD. I am joined by Lucy Jaffe, who is Associate Commissioner for Housing Policy. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. All of the data presented today, as well as those in our report, the selected initial findings, come from the data collected as part of the New York City Housing and Vacancy Survey, or NYC HVS. The 2023 survey is the 19th time the City of New York has conducted the NYC HVS, which is completed about every 3 years going back to 1965. It is the longest running housing survey in the country and is a unique source of timely and accurate data on various aspects of our city's housing and resident population that is relied on by a wide range of decision makers across various policy domains. Today, I'll share some of the key findings from our citywide assessment of the housing supply, its condition, and the continued need for the regulation of residential rents and evictions. I will also provide some additional information that is specific to the rent-stabilized stock. The NYC HVS is a scientific survey distinct from much of the other data available. It represents every residential housing unit in the 5 boroughs. Our sample is randomly drawn from a complete list of all residential addresses in the city to ensure our survey is inclusive of every type of housing in every community. At the heart of our data are the interviews completed each cycle with thousands of New Yorkers. In 2023, we completed about 10,000 interviews. These interviews are conducted by trained census field representatives in multiple languages, using a set of questions that are designed to collect accurate and complete information in a neutral way. Our census field team conducts in-person observations of each sampled unit. Interview data are combined with other information from administrative sources, such as New York State Homes and Community Renewal's rent registration data, code enforcement data, tax information from the New York City Department of Finance, HPD's own production data, and more, all of which is matched to sampled units to provide a comprehensive picture of housing in New York City. Our data are weighted by survey statisticians to ensure the NYC HVS represents all of the 3.7 million housing units and the more than 8 million New Yorkers who call this city home. The NYC HVS survey methodology follows best practices used by academic and scientific studies across the country and enables us to report reliable and valid information to all of you and to the New Yorkers who are represented in our data. The 2023 NYC HVS was conducted from January through the middle of July 2023. Although the NYC HVS is the most up-to-date representative information currently available, it is important to note that it reflects this point in time. Although the NYC HVS includes all types of housing, it is also uniquely able to speak to the rent-stabilized stock and tenant population. It is the only source of information on the sociodemographics of rent-stabilized tenants, and the only data source that can speak to the entire supply of units subject to rent stabilization. This includes all of the units registered with HCR, as well as additional units not captured in their database. It includes all buildings with rent-stabilized units, regardless of the types of owners or the size of the building. The citywide net rental vacancy rate in 2023 was 1.41%. This is one of the lowest vacancy rates recorded since the NYC HVS began and stands in stark contrast to the 4.54% net rental vacancy rate recorded in 2021, which was one of the highest vacancy rates on record. For rent-stabilized units, the net rental vacancy rate was 0.98% in 2023, down from 4.57% in 2021. There was very limited supply across all price ranges, But of those that were available, most would not be affordable to the typical New Yorker. In 2023, the median household income for all renters was $70,000. The median asking rent for units available for rent in 2023 was $3,000. To afford that, a family would have to earn at least $120,000 a year. For rent-stabilized units, the median asking rent was $2,500. That's the same as it was in 2021. That would require a family to earn at least $100,000 a year. To understand what's driving these low vacancy rates, I'd like to walk through the components of our housing supply with a specific focus on how it changed by comparing point-in-time estimates from 2021 and 2023, or the net change between the two surveys. In 2023, there were 3.7 million housing units. This is the largest stock recorded since the NYC HVS began in 1965. That's a net increase of 61,000 units, or about a 2% increase relative to 2021, which is the sum of both losses and gains. This growth in the housing supply continues the trend seen over the last several cycles of the NYC HVS. Despite the increase in supply, it failed to keep pace with increased demand. Between 21 and 2023, the total number of occupied units increased by 275,000 units, or 9%, relative to just 2 years prior. This increase in households was seen for both renter and owner-occupied units. This tight housing market meant that more units of every kind were occupied in 2023, including far fewer units available for rent and far fewer units that were off the market. Let's look at the changes in a slightly different way. Here, we are looking at the units that were in both the 2021 and 2023 surveys to assess what happened to them over the 2-year period between cycles. Across all types of rental housing, 95% of units that were occupied in 2021 were also occupied in 2023, though not always by the same household. 83% of the units that were available for rent in 2021 were occupied at our follow-up. And as a reminder, most of the units that were for rent in 2021 were higher cost units. And 62% of all units that had been off the market in 2021 were occupied in 2023. In the bottom bar here, we see that among rent-stabilized units that had been off the market for any reason in 2021, 75% were occupied 2 years later. The NYC HVS measures housing conditions through self-report of the current occupants regarding various housing problems. In 2021, 14% of occupied units reported 3 or more of the 7 types of problems we asked about. The prevalence of housing problems increased again in 2023 to 15%, up by 1 percentage point from 2021. Despite the difference in composition, both rent-stabilized and market rentals showed similar net changes in the rate of reported problems. Between 2021 and 2023, the share of rent-stabilized units that reported no problems fell by 8.2 percentage points, while the share of market rentals with no reported problems fell by 7.6 percentage points. When we examine the changes in housing conditions over many years, we see that rent-stabilized units and market rentals generally trend together. Here we're looking at the change in the share of units with 3 or more reported problems indexed to the prevalence in 2002 for both rent-stabilized and market rentals. Rent stabilization covers about 1 million units in New York City and comprises units across a range of rents, conditions, and resident needs. In 2023, rent stabilization covered both low-income and higher-income tenants, as well as both long-term tenants and new residents. Over time, it has become even more varied as a result of affordable housing and tax incentive programs, as well as higher rent units that would have been eligible for decontrol but now remain subject to rent stabilization because of changes enacted in 2019. Household incomes in New York City shifted substantially upward between 2021 and 2023, with increases in the median incomes of both renters and owners. The median income of rent-stabilized tenants increased less sharply than that of market renters. However, both rent-stabilized and market rentals saw a net loss of the lowest income households. This pattern of an increasing number of higher income renters and fewer low-income renters cannot be explained by wage growth alone. Our NYC HVS analysis shows that households who are moving in are earning more than those who are moving out, and that the majority of the newest New Yorkers are earning over $100,000. This is not surprising given the cost of available homes in New York City. Rent stabilization covers a wide range of rents, but this segment of our housing supply remains the largest source of low-cost housing in New York City. And here you can see in 2023, this is the distribution of rents for rent stabilized and market rentals by essentially rent quartile. Citywide, rents increased by 9% in nominal terms since 2021, generally in line with our historically high rates of inflation during this period. Rent stabilized units increased by 7% in nominal terms, with a median rent well below citywide of $1,500. In contrast, market rentals increased by 10% in nominal terms, with a median rent of $2,000. The number of low-cost rent-stabilized units has declined over time. Historic levels of affordable housing production have not been able to keep pace with the loss. Since 1993, New York City has experienced a net loss of over 600,000 units with rents less than $1,500 in inflation-adjusted 2023 dollars. This includes about 350,000 older rent-stabilized units. There is insufficient supply of all types of housing at every price level in every neighborhood, but the lack of supply among the lowest cost units is of particular concern. In summary, citywide, the 2023 NYC HVS showed a stark change in 2 years since our last survey. The citywide net rental vacancy rate was historically low at 1.41%. There was a very limited supply across all price ranges, but of those that were available, most would not be affordable to the typical New Yorker. While the overall supply continued to increase, it was insufficient to keep pace with the large net increase in the number of households. The prevalence of housing problems increased across all types of housing, back to levels similar to what we found in the 2011 survey. Citywide, rents increased at a pace similar to our historically high inflation during this period, up 9% in nominal terms. Perhaps the most dramatic shift was in household incomes. New York City continued to see a diverging experience where low and middle income New Yorkers face limited housing choice, while New Yorkers with more purchasing power continue to grow in numbers. Many of the challenges that we see citywide are reflected in the rent-stabilized stock and tenant population. These include historically low net rental vacancy rates, limited availability of rental housing at all price levels, but particularly lower cost housing, and high rates of occupancy, including in homes that had been off the market in 2021. We also saw a dramatic increase in more affluent households and a corresponding net loss of low-income renters. Although more muted, these same patterns are playing out in rent-stabilized housing as well. As you know, rent stabilization comprises a wide range of units and tenants across a spectrum of rents, conditions, and tenant incomes. Despite this large and diverse segment of our housing supply, rent stabilization remains the largest supply of low-cost housing in New York City and a vital source of stability for low-income renters. We are currently working to publish the 2021 NYC HVS microdata. Until that is publicly available, we are subject to Census Bureau disclosure review processes. We're happy to work with you and the RGB staff if you have additional data requests or questions that we can't answer today. It's okay. Thank you so much for all of the work that you do, and we're happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Let me just get the lights. This is it's a great presentation. But okay, there we go. Thank you. Just do you have a sense of timing on the microdata? I know we often have follow-up questions, and we're happy to bother you about them, but it's helpful if you have that.
Sure. Yeah, we've obviously produced some custom tabulations for the RGB team. Happy to keep doing that until those data are public. We're working with the Census Bureau now. We don't have a fixed date, although we expect it'll probably be around the time of your final vote, I expect. Sorry about that.
Okay, well, thank you. Let me open the floor for questions. Rob and then Arpit.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a question, is it possible to get the data broken down by core Manhattan and the individual boroughs?
Sorry, which data?
Well, the general data looks like it's all about New York City as a whole. So a lot of the work that we do centers on whether it's Manhattan, core Manhattan, upper Manhattan, Bronx, the outer boroughs. Is there any way to get that information?
Yeah, so we produce many, actually thousands of estimates for our initial report. We do focus on citywide because we're thinking about integrated policy across all areas. That said, we're happy to work on custom geographies, but we'll just need to get our arms around what specific estimates you're looking for cut that way, and then we can work with Census to see if we can provide those to you.
Sorry, real quick, Esther. I just got a text that they're not able to hear you as well.
Okay, I'll speak up. I tend to be a little too quiet, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much to you and your team for your work. Two quick questions. The first is about reconciling your estimates with census population counts. So I think according to the census, the city population has dropped about 6% since before the pandemic, with continuing declines in 2023, whereas you find large increases in occupied units. So I can think of at least two reasons why that might happen. One is that census might undercount the population. Another is that there may be more household formation, more people occupying units, even though there are fewer people in the city overall.
Certainly, yes, to the last two, and it's very possible also to the first possibility. So let me explain a little bit about the way that census, we're also a census product, so let me talk a little bit about different sources and how some of these estimates come out, and then let me speak to potential reasons that explains how both things can in fact and are seemingly true. So first of all, we work with the U.S. Census Bureau. They're our vendor for this particular survey. So along with all census products, our data are weighted to be representative of their current housing unit estimates and then separately their population estimates. Those are actually two separate intercensal estimates that different divisions of the U.S. Census Bureau work to produce and weight their products up to that. So for our survey, we haven't actually been sharing population estimates yet. We haven't gotten that far in our analysis. Everything that we have talked about in our report, in our prior testimony, and today is households and housing units. We think about that as our first line analysis because that is the sort of unit of analysis for demand for housing, right? Households live in housing units. That said, we do obviously have population estimates that we produce as well. We're working on those for the next few weeks and months. But yes, independent population estimates have been released by the census that does show this general pattern of declining resident population. And that is plausible, even as our data show that the number of households continues to grow. So a very large part of that is that you can think of just the spacing out of people into more households, smaller households, and therefore a fewer number of people, in fact, can consume more housing. And if you take sort of a large step back from a timeline and look at population changes in demographic and household composition change over time, we do see that New York City has increasingly become one of smaller and smaller households. And there are obviously strong correlations with demographic and income patterns as well.
And then one other question about rent burdens. So you're documenting declining real rents, right? Because rents have gone up by not as much as inflation, and it seems like incomes are outpacing inflation growth. So does that imply then that rental burdens have declined in aggregate, or how does that vary by different parts of the housing stock?
Yeah, sure. So I didn't focus on that today in these slides, but of course we've presented that in our publicly available report. We're happy to pull those out and share them with you. Specifically, we have seen a very, very dramatic shift in the socioeconomic composition of New Yorkers. That comes from a variety of sources, but a lot of the evidence that we've seen in our own survey, as well as that research done by others, shows that there has been, as opposed to only wage growth, meaning the existing households having more income, that what we're really seeing is a form of replacement where higher earners are moving to New York and lower income renters are leaving New York City. Within that context, that means that as we've had this very substantial shift in incomes, we do, for the first time in several NYC HVS cycles, see that the citywide prevalence of rent burden has come down, right? There is a lesser number and a lower share of overall citywide households who are rent burdened in 2023. But that said, when we then break that out by income groups, we see, in fact, no shift in rent burden at all among our lowest income renters. Even middle income renters are still seeing extraordinarily high and consistent levels of rent burden, and that really that shift in lower rent burden is just simply a result of higher earners who are consuming rental housing that is well within their means.
And if I recall, you break that out by rent stabilized as well?
We don't in our report, but we do have that, and we're happy to share that with you all.
I think that would be helpful.
Yeah.
Alex?
Thank you. So the data on incomes are really pretty remarkable. It's a couple of questions. As I remember, in the publicly available data, there was something like a 40 or 50% increase in 2 years among households earning I think it was $100,000 or more.
Yeah, that's correct.
To see an increase like that in 2 years is pretty unheard of. And I'm curious if the microdata will allow us to see if that's attributable to higher income people moving in or existing residents earning a lot more money very quickly. I mean, you never see increases like that in such a short period of time. And I just wondering if there's been extra checks on the data collection and analysis to be sure that there's no error in that, because it really is extraordinary.
Yeah, so let me take that in a couple of parts. Yes, I agree that is quite extraordinary, and we have not seen anything like this. One of my slides that I did share was looking at over a fairly long time frame at just median income. So that's not even looking by subsets of income groups, but the median income, you also see a very stark shift in a very short period of time. In our citywide report, we have shown that there was the largest growth, net change in that highest earning group, which we define as earning $100,000 or more. And you're right, it was an increase of almost 45% in 2 years, and growth of almost 500,000 households in that income category. So that's very dramatic, you're right. We have worked for many, many cycles of the NYC HVS to collect really accurate household income information. You obviously have used our microdata for a long time. We appreciate all of your use of our data and your publications. So for those of you who are not familiar with how we collect this, let me just explain a little bit about the incomes in particular. Households, of course, there are many single adults who live alone in New York City, and household income, therefore, is the same as their individual income. But of course, for many households in New York City, income comprises not only multiple earners, but also obviously many sources. And over time, incomes become more complex, particularly in a city like New York City. We have many more people who have incomes from multiple sources, multiple jobs, changing jobs, et cetera. So this, in fact, becomes very important to measure in a very specific way that we know is going to give us reliable but also valid information that we can then aggregate up and use in various ways. So for our 2021 survey, we underwent a full redesign of how we collected all of our data. We did this across the board, and we made important improvements to how we collected, among other things, household income. So the basic concept remains the same, although now we just simply ask more questions and more prompts to make sure we're capturing all different types of income. 2023, we did exactly the same measurements as 21, so I will say none of the changes in data collection are what is spurring the shift, right? That's identical between the two cycles. So we ask in in-person interviews for each individual member of a household that lives in one of our sampled units. We ask the amount of income collected in the prior year by source. And we go through many items where we sort of specifically ask about incomes of different types. Wages, part-time work, income from cash assistance, right, that's received by the household. And we go through and we work with each of those individual items, then that ultimately is aggregated up by person and then across multiple earners to get to a household income. So there's a lot of due diligence that goes into that, and it takes up actually a disproportionate share of our interview time to make sure that we're asking those questions and getting all of that data accurately across all persons. Thank you for the question.
Hi, nice to see you. If I asked the chart you have on page 11 about housing conditions indexed back 20 years. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. We're just going to pull it up so that
Yeah.
others, including those
Can you-
watching, can see what we're referencing.
The trend of
Sorry,
rent
Nestor.
stabilized and market rate is remarkably the same, which you point out. Any sense of why that would be? I think we're struggling with measures of distress in the rent stabilized housing stock. And as you know, one thing that we're looking at is violation data or problems.
Yeah.
But I'm actually struck by how remarkably similar it is between the two types where I would not have expected that.
Right, and I think thank you for that, and thank you for noting that. I think it's part of why we have tried to present those two types of housing together to show how remarkably similar they are and over a very long time frame. So obviously, let me start by saying that the composition of those two segments of our housing are obviously very different, right? They have different rent profiles, they're different ages of buildings, they have different
All right, well.
different tenant profiles. But they do track very closely together, and they do, in fact, going back all the way back to 91. I think we showed here 2002, so the last 20 years. But even when you look back in the last 30 years, they really do track very closely together. To us, that's a signal that it is less about rent stabilization per se, or other types of housing policy. Same thing, right, is true for example, in NYCHA, right, or just market conditions where there's no price controls in effect at all. That rent stabilization, the segment of our housing stock, is relatively insensitive to policy changes that then play out in terms of the actual quality, and that it's more about these other broader situations that affect all housing across the board.
And if you broke that down further by pre-74, like in the rent stabilized stock versus post-73, would you see, and then by borough, would you see the same phenomenon?
Yes, in fact,
So
we
it
do.
doesn't really make
Yeah.
a difference?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Let me ask a follow-up.
Okay, so that,
Just in terms of you talk about these larger macro conditions that affect housing quality across the entire portfolio. I'm wondering if you could just say a little bit about what some of those are and what you're seeing in the data.
That's a great question. It's an important one. Those are not data that we collect or analyze in any specific way. I mean, I could hypothesize, as I'm sure other board members here could. But really what we're seeing is that this is less about specific regulation, either incentives or disincentives for certain kind of work, and more about those macroeconomic conditions, many of the things that you're talking about even earlier today. Changes in cost of work, changes in need. There's clearly time period effects of when large systems are more frequently put in, and then when they reach the end of their useful life, and the cycle of building as well that is in fact inevitable of when certain buildings reach that first end of useful life for major building systems. I don't know if you have anything else to add to that.
Just to clarify, when you say reported housing conditions, it's what's reported to the interviewer when you're interviewing? Okay.
Yeah, so this is, I don't want to assume sort of a follow-up question, but maybe let me answer this in a slightly broader way. HPD obviously is very invested in housing quality and housing problems measured in various ways, right? That's what our many of our programs focus on doing, is maintaining habitability and safety. And we recognize it's an important measure that is part of our NYC HVS. For many, many cycles, decades in fact, the NYC HVS has measured 7 items in a fairly standard way. We have collected those through our in-person interviews, through validated, tested questions that ask about specific items. Heating breakdown in the last winter. You want to ask in advance, or you want to wait for the rest of my answer? Oh, okay. heating breakdowns, leaks, toilet breakdowns, right? They're standard items that are markers, sometimes of conditions in specific units, but also some items that are obviously even though they're measured at a unit level, they speak to a broader building condition. And those are self-report. They're carefully tested questions, but they are self-report. So we measure them for a very specific reference period. We ask consistently across every single housing unit in our sample exactly the same questions so that we're really collecting quantitative data. But the important part of that is that we are asking those same questions and doing that in a consistent way for a representative sample of all housing units, not only those where a condition has been reported or it's been involved in our code enforcement system or any other things like that. We're really trying to make sure that we are asking for everyone so that we can get a true representative picture of that housing supply and condition.
Just one follow-up question. You had mentioned in your slides that you work with HCR to identify the stabilized unit. So when you go in, when the interviewer goes into that interview, they know that that unit is stabilized?
No, so it's, we, the broad project knows, I mean, I don't know what the sampled units are, but our census team knows that that's rent stabilized because they've sampled it, but our field team is blinded to all of those characteristics.
So, but the identifying it as a stabilized unit is using what the interviewer finds from the tenant or from the data that you have?
Yes and yes. We go through a very robust process to identify all types of housing that are in our survey, but particularly rent stabilized. Not only is it sort of a centerpiece of our survey, but it's complicated to identify units that are subject to rent stabilization. So we do have a longstanding good working partnership with HCR. We use all of the rent registration data that are matched to our sampled units. That's done not in the field, but in the back end by the census, our census survey statisticians. But that's not that's only the beginning point for identifying rent stabilized units. We then supplement that with other sources of administrative data. Department of Finance records, information about the building, when it was constructed, how many residential units, HPD's information about whether it's part of an affordable housing program, whether it's been part of a tax incentive program, 421A, J51, various iterations, and whether that participation makes that unit subject to rent stabilization. We then also mix in information from the interview that we collect, again, for across all rental units. When the first person in that household moved to the unit, if there has been succession from a prior tenancy, right, that's particularly important for rent control estimates, so on and so forth. All told, I think it's about a 30-step process that we use to identify if a specific unit is subject to rent stabilization.
Thank you. Arpit.
Yeah, this is a follow-up to Doug's question earlier. So I'm looking at table 11 of the housing vacancy survey. So this is showing reported housing problems across rent stabilized and market rentals. So for example, for heating breakdowns, it happens 9% of cases in market rentals, but 20% in rent stabilized units, or rodents are 22% in market rentals, 39% in rent stabilized units. So it seems like while the time series trends are similar across the two types of stocks, there are large level differences in the number of violations between rent stabilized and market rate rentals.
Not violations. Reported housing problems. Yes,
Reported
absolutely.
housing
And almost all of that is explained by those compositional differences of age, size, tenancy, et cetera. But absolutely, there are large differences in the C level, but the actual tracking together of changes and what impels something to be higher or lower quality over time, those are the things that track together.
Can you break that chart that you're looking at, this is a broad survey, do it over time as well? Or just
Yeah, it is over time. Figure, you're looking at table 11, but figure 13. We will send over this report as well as all of our slides to you, but figure 13 is over time back to 91.
Yeah, I think I sent it's a summary report you're talking about, right? Yeah, we sent that out. Yeah, and I wasn't thinking I should have had it in your folders today.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I ask a related but slightly different question? This may be as much for Lucy as it is for you. Last year we had some conversation about preservation programs, And I know that's a kind of changing and evolving landscape, and we have a new successor to J51. We have Unlocking Doors. And this may just be a request for follow-up information, but I'm curious, what's the kind of current landscape of availability, and what's the uptake, and what are the challenges, if any, you're seeing? I would just love to get some information about kind of targeted support for renovation and housing quality.
Yes, thank you for that question. So J51, though passed at the state level, still needs to be enacted at the local level, so it is not yet accessible, which continues to be a challenge and something that we're hoping changes quite soon. And we believe will make a substantial difference. You did mention the Unlocking Doors program, which is a pilot, and which is, I think, a couple months in at this point. But in terms of the bulk of our preservation programs, we have seen there was a dip, which we probably talked about last year, and there were many discussions on what was going on in terms of HPD's production. But we have had a more than doubling and almost tripling of the number of units that were preserved for 2023 over 2022. So while we're not quite back to sort of recent historic preservation levels, we're getting close.
Thank you. Other questions?
Just a quick question before I get to the next question. In terms of Unlocking Doors, there was one application? How many applications for that program have there been?
We've had 2 applications. One was determined to be eligible.
Okay, thank you. So I guess I know that Elizabeth, you touched on this a little earlier, but could you maybe talk about what the HVS shows in terms of like the impact of something like the HSTPA more generally? I know you again alluded to it in terms of conditions context, but.
Sure. So I will say we are currently working on much more detailed analysis as sort of our follow-up to this first statutory requirement that we do at the beginning of each cycle. So hope to be sharing that certainly later this year, even if it's not in time for this vote. I'm happy to come back and talk about some of that analysis in advance of next year's rent season. But that said, in 2021, we obviously included some limited information about that in our selected initial findings. Namely about the number of units that would have previously been eligible for vacancy, high rent vacancy decontrol. But I will say this, that in general, and this I don't think will seem strange to this board, it is extraordinarily difficult to actually target and identify the impacts of HSTPA in a detailed way simply because of the timing of COVID-19 and all of the dramatic dislocations and shifts that happened in our city in the months just shortly after the passage of those 2019 reforms. As we get further away from that, I think that there will be the opportunity to look at many of the different impacts, but we're still in relatively short-term follow-up for something that changed in that dramatic of a way and something that does actually generally change very slowly. The housing supply changes generally very slowly, but we really need to be able to get sort of past pandemic impacts to be able to understand or even begin to tease out the specific effects of the 2019 reforms. That said, we do know that rent stabilization is now sort of poised to have net growth for the first time in a very long time. It has not yet shifted and seen growth, but if all things sort of held equal, affordable housing production continues, if other kinds of tax incentive programs return, we will no longer see the net loss that we had seen of older rent stabilized units and are poised to really start seeing a net gain. That also gives us, I think, the chance for a longer view on the true impact, positive or negative, of the 2019 reforms.
Christina.
Thanks, Elizabeth. So you just talked about rent stabilized growth in the context of affordable and also hopefully a 421A program coming back. What about the 26,000 vacant apartments as reported by DHCR? Would that be something that HPD would be in favor of trying to help move the legislature in terms of the effects of HSTPA, right? HSTPA took those units essentially out of circulation for all intents and purposes.
So thank you for that question. What we would say is that low vacancy is actually the defining characteristic both of New York City for decades, but of this exact moment. So HCR's registration data is sort of one way of looking at it. We also presented our findings, which are not inconsistent with that data, but it is a different source and a different way of looking at it. And more than ever, we do not have very many vacant units. And on any given day, there are not enough, right? So there are on any given day tens of thousands of vacant units, but that is not enough for the sheer number of people who live in New York City and are looking for a home. And so what we would say is we actually need, you mentioned 421A, thank you for that. We need more supply at all levels, particularly at the low cost levels, so that people actually can find available housing for them to move into. So there has been a lot of confusion over the last year or so about what those findings mean, but 23 data shows now more than ever that we do not have very many vacant units, and that's actually sort of the strongest indicator of a problem that we have.
How do we close the gap between the HCR data, which is 26,000 units empty, and your data, which I think last summer was 2,500 in need of renovation?
So those numbers are not equivalent. So let's walk through. I think we should both walk through what is the HCR registration process and what that means, and then how we sort of think and how we can think about those.
Yeah, so let me just try to clarify for everyone sort of all of the different numbers here. So, and then we can talk about different estimates by source. So I think the 26,000 that you're asking about are the rent stabilized units that we identified as being off the market in 2023. I think that's the 26,000 that you're referencing.
Registered vacant.
Okay, no, thank you. I'm glad I asked. That's a different number. Okay. Let's start sort of overall. So in New York City, and there's obviously other rent stabilized, but we're focusing just on the 5 boroughs. Rent stabilized units are required to do an annual registration with HCR, right, with the state. That's been true since the omnibus of 1983, right? And this is what we sort of generally shorthand as rent registrations or HCR data. So those are registrations by owners of each individual unit and building as of April 1st of a given year. There's limited information that's included about each unit as part of that registration process, but some of that is very critical to all of us who use it. The legal rent, actual rent that's registered for that unit, and includes what its status is as of April 1st. And those are very broad categories. HCR captures if there's a current tenant, and if so, that tenant's information. If it's registered as vacant, no other information about the status of that vacancy, or if it's exempt, right? These are the apartment categories. So for the HCR data that captured vacant registered units, there are two important sort of things to keep in mind when you're then comparing it to NYC HVS data. First of all, it's limited only to registered units, which we know is not the full universe of rent stabilized units in New York City. As I said before, we go above and beyond that to try to capture all units that are subject to rent stabilization, regardless of registration status. And then second of all, right, vacant can come in many forms. In our data, we not only capture vacant and available for rent, or separately vacant and available for sale, or both, but also what we call vacant and not available, or what I sort of shorthand to off the market, and the reasons why. We capture 17 reasons why a unit may not be available for rent at the time of our survey. And many of those are sort of natural, right, and healthy things that units have to be off the market for a period of time for renovation, because they're rented, but somebody isn't moving in yet, et cetera, right? There are many reasons that a unit can be off the market for a short or longer period of time. HCR's registration data doesn't capture whether the unit is available for rent or not, or other details about it. It's that point in time, just whether it's vacant or not. So those numbers are broadly, qualitatively similar to some of the measures that we capture in our survey, but they're really not apples to apples, and they're not intended to be used for the same purposes.
Genesis.
Yeah, I think it's important to notice that, to note that many, I mean, as somebody who works on the ground organizing in rent stabilized units, many citywide advocates have demonstrated, because of the organizing, that many of the unregistered units that a DACR has reported are not actually vacant, right? And that's why the governor signed legislation this past January to fine those owners that failed to register the units. So if it wasn't such a big issue, that I don't think that legislation was signed. And it's just to force the landlords to register the units, because there's no correlation between the vacant units and the unregistered units. Most of the registered units are occupied from what we had shown on the ground.
Thank you. Christine?
There's always been an incentive to register units outside of a fine. You're right, the state legislature did just pass a fine for not registering units, but if your stabilized units are not registered, there's a prohibition on collecting rent. And so there is certainly, if a landlord wants to collect rent in a non-payment proceeding, they have to report that the unit is registered. So there are some other fail-safes within the rent stabilization code that ensures that units will be registered. Just wanted to point that out.
And let me also just sort of add that an important factor here is, we all of us, including the Rent Guidelines Board staff here, use various sources of information for various purposes, right? And in some cases, we have to be a little creative about what sources of data we use, how we get it, combining things to try to answer really critical questions. We do this for policies, right, above and beyond rent stabilization all the time. But there are limitations to the reason that certain data are collected, how they're captured, the limitations for data privacy and confidentiality of how we can use certain sources of data. And HCR rent registration data they're a very powerful tool and great resource that we certainly use a lot for different purposes, but they are limited because they are intended to be just that. They are an administrative record used to administer rent stabilization. And it's one of the reasons that we go above and beyond that and capture additional information so that we can really use that for research purposes and understanding the broader situation.
Don and then Christina.
Thank you. Just a few comments and then a large question. I'm not quite sure what the answer will be, but I'm interested to hear your thoughts. So in terms of sort of the thoughts I've had, I'm hearing the main takeaway, I think, being this replacement sort of idea theory, right? I thought it was pretty stark, not only the net loss of low-cost units over the last 30 years, the 600,000 units. I think also the fact that, 15% of rent-stabilized units are at the highest asking rent level, and I think 40% is over $1,600. Is that accurate, right?
Yeah, 40% were above median, the $1,650, and about 10% are in that top rent quartile. Yep.
Right. So again, just making say, I think this is really powerful, particularly for for long-standing residents of New York City, Black and Brown communities, specifically the data that you provided about their replacement and not just displacement, I think is pretty again powerful. The question I had, which is a broad one, is I'm trying to understand again how you guys work with the census information. What I really appreciate about this HVS is that you have such granular information. You know what I mean? And so we talk often about how some of the financial data that we receive is incomplete. And I'm wondering, I realize it's not currently within your purview, perhaps, but what could HPD and through the HVS or something like that, what information could we gather from the entire rent-stabilized building stock about their finances, about owners' finances?
That's a great question, and thank you. We do try our best to collect a broad range of information to try to give, depth to the picture as well as sort of breadth and over time. So a couple of things. One, we have, over the last several years, worked to really expand our access to internal files, meaning They're sort of within the data privacy wall. In fact, the data are physically located at census headquarters that we access only with federal clearances. But to be able to access that, we in fact have the opportunity to merge many other data sources to our sample than we could even in the not so distant past, right? So since its beginning, the NYC HVS is pretty unusual in that we've always used a combination of survey and administrative data. We did that even back in the 60s, which is pretty remarkable in the survey research world. But obviously there's more and more data available. And so we have worked to establish a way where we can add additional information. That gives us just a tremendous amount of granularity to produce analysis. So that includes not only things like the HCR data and HPD production and DOF, but we've recently entered into an agreement with the OCA to be able to merge in eviction records. So we're looking to do that in the coming weeks and months. We're continuing to work with different agencies to get that granular level data so that we can use that. So all of that said, if there's specific things that the board is interested in looking at where we can combine not only building level and owner information, but also then connect that with the tenant information we collect at a unit level, that's certainly something that we could explore with the board. So that's on the sort of not collecting different data, but just using data in a slightly different way and trying to leverage those resources. There is, I think, while we were going through our major redesign right before the pandemic hit, we had talked internally and talked with the Census Bureau about adding additional module to collect information on the owners of buildings where we have a sampled unit. For various reasons, we couldn't do that for 2021, and just have still been trying to get back up to a point where we're sort of in a more state of normal before we can start expanding the survey again. But certainly that's something that we've talked about in the past, and we're open to, particularly if that would be helpful for decisions like the ones that you all are making here.
Thank you. Christina.
I had going back to HSTPA, you described that you'll reveal some impacts of HSTPA, but that COVID threw it off. Is that right? That Don asked about the impacts of HSTPA and you weren't able to give us any of the impacts, but what are you anticipating some of the impacts being?
I'm a quantitative sociologist and statistician, so I don't do a lot of anticipating my findings. But we're looking at a whole range of research questions, right, based on what we have available. In particular, I think we're really interested in understanding shifts in turnover, demographics of who is occupying those units, the changes in rents, particularly at turnover and vacancy, where we know before HSTPA, my team had done extensive analysis and saw really very large rent increases at vacancy. Presumably those are flattened, but the data will tell us of how that plays out. And obviously looking also at how that correlates with things like building conditions, right, financial distress, variety of different measures. So all of that is in the early stages, but I want to sort of temper expectations because of the impact of COVID being simultaneous or almost immediately after the passage of HSTPA. It's very difficult, not just for me and my team with our data, but for anyone to identify and measure the impact of HSTPA independent of all of the other things that changed at almost the same time.
I will certainly say if I could get Liz to predict more often, my job would be a bit easier. But the city is very focused on what we can do to support buildings. We know that there are a lot of challenges for both tenants and owners in this housing market. So we are both advocating at the state level for resources that could help us expand our housing supply. That also will be beneficial. There's a lot of discussion about rising costs. There was mention earlier about insurance. That is a big focus as well. So there is a lot that is also happening at the moment. So it's not that everything here is or is not dependent on whether or not we can isolate these things out, but identifying the challenges that both tenants and owners are facing and figure out what are the right tools that we need to address those.
Thank you.
Just one comment. So this was obviously HVS focused. We wanted that because it's great information that we use all the time. Your testimony from last year, Lucy, if we could work together and maybe update some of the numbers that's there and just give it to us as a document like that again regarding the programs that HPD does and where the levels they're at and stuff like that. Does that make sense that we could do that?
If that would be helpful to you, then it makes sense to us.
Okay, yeah, we'll discuss. So.
Thank you. This is one last question. I mean, not to cut anyone off, but you had another question, please.
Maybe you already answered this, but I don't quite remember. Is there a correlation between the incomes, between the higher incomes and the new? You said there was an increase in incomes between 2021 and 23, and I wonder if there's a correlation between that and the new residents, the newcomers, people who move in after the last survey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I did not share that in slides today, although I mentioned it in my words, my testimony. It is included in our selected initial findings. We're happy to, again, circulate, rather than, it can be overwhelming. There's a lot in the report, so we can pull out some of those select figures and share. But we did look at what we refer to as sort of the newest New Yorkers and some of the sociodemographics of who has moved to New York for the first time between our 2021 survey and our 2023 survey. And we do see very, I think, clear differences in sociodemographics. Significantly higher income households moving to New York City, over half of whom are earning over $100,000. The median income within that highest earning group is $200,000. So we're talking about folks with a fair amount of financial resources moving here. And the much larger share is white, headed by a white New Yorker. And the vast majority of those folks are renters. So this is really entering this rental market that we're talking about here today. And I will say it's not a small number of people who have moved here in the recent last couple of years.
I noticed most of the distressed buildings are not, or units are not in the buildings that are 100% rent stabilized. Most of the distressed units are in buildings that are mixed with market rate. And I wonder, and also we noticed that the market rates, the amount of repair issues, self-reported issues, are about the same with people who live in rent stabilized. And I wonder if you have any data to compare the number of repair issues in mixed buildings to those that are 100% rent stabilized.
Yeah, it's a great question. I'll say up front, I don't have answers to that, although that's certainly something that we've been exploring. To the extent that we have data that we pull, we can certainly share that. But I will say a couple of things that I think are relevant to that broader question. First of all, as I said today, that rent stabilization is a very diverse segment of our stock, right? You all certainly know that, and you are presented with a lot of data that shows the different aspects of that. That includes different compositions within a building, right? And I think it's really valuable that the RGB staff has sort of split things out by 100% stabilized or only partially rent stabilized. I think in general in the work that we do, and this is not an HVS number, but in general the analysis we do and looking at all of the data that we do, 100% rent stabilized buildings are actually not very common. And where you do have those, they're usually the result of participation because of a certain program. Right? So affordable housing, right? A rental building is going to be 100% rent stabilized because all the units are subject to a regulatory agreement. In many cases, maybe not so much now with 421A 16 and then no 421A 17, 23, whatever the number will be. But 421A 15, right, those were even including market units were subject to rent stabilization and remain so for the length of that benefit. J51, obviously, while it was in place, right, would make all of the units in a building subject to rent stabilization. So that's where you actually see where you have sort of solidly, entirely rent stabilized buildings are almost always because of one of those secondary programs that obviously has a strong association with what's happening in that building, the resources coming in and also the needs of those buildings. Whereas sort of statutory rent stabilized buildings subject because of ETPA, right? There's decontrol has been scattered throughout that. The other side of that issue on distress that I just will point out is that the income and expense study presented earlier today looks at building level distress. We don't refer to this as distress, but we've been asked a lot over the last few years about rent-stabilized units that are off the market, in need of repairs, low cost, right? With the sort of the working idea being that those units don't have sufficient rents to cover the repairs and therefore are staying off the market for a long period of time. Some of you may know that in our 21 survey, we dug into that to try to answer that question and came up with a very small number of units that met those criteria. And in 2021, we looked at units that were rent stabilized, had been empty for 12 months or more, were in need of repairs, which again, we sort of used a kitchen sink approach to try to get every possible unit that would need repairs measured in various ways, and had a low rent, which we defined as a legal rent of less than $1,000. Citywide, that was about 2,700 units in 2021. We, of course, then wanted to see if that number had grown, as we had heard that it maybe was growing. And so in the 2023 survey, again, all of these methods were the same. We went back, we tried to drill down to get at those same units. In fact, there were so few units with the criteria that we couldn't measure it. It was literally not a reliable enough number with our sample. And so we increased the legal rent up to 1,500, which is the median across all rent stabilized units. And that number with that larger tranche of rents is 1,700 in 2023. So, but again, unit level, conditions are not necessarily the same as building level. Those 1,700 units could be scattered in 1,700 buildings, that the buildings themselves may or may not have other markers of distress. And likewise, those buildings that show signs of financial or physical distress may or may not have units that have been vacant with low rents and in need of repairs. So they're not the same measure, but they're sort of related. And so I just wanted to be able to share that with all of you here today.
Arpit, and then I know, Don, you had, and Hennessy's has one more. Do you want to just ask your follow-up, and then Arpit will, please.
Okay, so maybe you don't have the answer for this, but I wonder if you have any data that maybe has a comparison of like the number of distressed units, and I wonder if you see any correlation between the distressed units and the units or buildings that were over leveraged. The amount that it was sold for and the actual value of it. Like, is there a correlation between those and the repair issue, right? That's one question. I also wanted you maybe to talk a little bit about the Partners in Preservation program, if you can. I know that's not your strength. You do research, but I know last year we talked about the programs available for landlords, and now in 2019, HPD did the pilot program for the Partners in Preservation, but this year it decided to do the program, and it's a program to empower tenants and not necessarily owners. So I wonder, why do you see the need to have this program back? And I also have another, it's a lot, I just taking advantage. You said that there may be, or there is an increase in small apartments there may be an increase in demand, right? Possibly because there are smaller households. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if there's a correlation between just the need a smaller household and the actual number of smaller apartments, right? Because what we have seen is a lot of illegal conversions, a lot of apartments being cut in half for the same, let's say a whole apartment was $2,000, but now half of the unit will be $2,000 and the other one will be $2,000, right? Which is why we try to get rid of, we passed the Frankenstein bill this past December. So I wonder if there's a correlation with that. Like, people are actually just having to seek smaller apartments because there are no bigger apartments available. Just that.
Just that. Okay. Let me. It's a good test of my memory. Let's see if we can work through these. So I have sort of three sets of questions that I got. The first is if we see individual unit conditions correlated with buildings that are over leveraged. We don't match those kinds of currently don't match those kinds of financial data to our sampled units. Although to the extent that we can sort of think as a partnership, right, on how we could do that, what would be useful, we're happy to look into that, but I can't speak to that from our data. I will pass the second question to Lucy in one moment, partners in preservation. But the third piece is on this, over time, this decrease in average household size and sort of more smaller households, which I will say also comes with a smaller share of households with children, right, increasing age distribution. There's demographic factors that also, right, are kit and parcel of this. Aging population has increasingly smaller household sizes for different reasons than young people have for living alone, et cetera. We do, in fact, see, as a result of all of that, increased demand, particularly for smaller units, right? And that's an important part of thinking about when we talk about adding supply, right, is not only thinking about cost of units and figuring out how we add sufficient supply, retain, and then add supply at the lowest end of the rent distribution, but also thinking about the sizes of those units and the match of that in neighborhoods and types of buildings with accessibility features, all of those different dimensions. So Lucy may be able to speak to that a little bit as well on the policy side. But that said, we recognize that larger units are also harder to come by and they're more costly. And so there are different needs to match when we're talking about sort of very broad aspects of supply and demand. And those things are not quite as simple when they play out on the ground. So certainly we've seen units subdivided, although we've also seen a lot of units combined over time, right, to be able to try to capture certain types of renters or owners who will, occupy a unit. But over time, we really have seen this growth of smaller households and this shift as a result of lots of different factors.
Thank you. I'll just note on the first part of the question that we do have other ways, while not through necessarily the NYC HVS, that we are looking at and working to support distressed buildings, including tracking buildings that may have been over-leveraged. And I would say, like with across all of our work, we are deeply concerned and want to make sure that we have resources available both for owners who find themselves in difficult financial situations, as well as for tenants who may find themselves in a difficult situation as a result. In terms of partners in preservation, we are expanding that. We're expanding because we think it was a good program and it was successful in the pilot. And it took us a couple of years because it has been a difficult set of financial years, and we've gone through COVID, et cetera. But the timing is based on the fact that we were able to secure additional resources for a program that we believe in. Did I answer all? I think I answered it. Yes.
So I just want to follow up on one comment to an earlier question about the proportion of 100% stabilized units. I believe you characterize those as uncommon, but I think our reporting, so this is Appendix 15 of our income and expenses study, finds that half of all buildings that have at least one rent stabilized unit are 100%.
To clarify, not uncommon in the city, but uncommon as a result of ETPA era statutorily obligated rent stabilized units that are not part of one of these other programs, tax benefit programs of various kinds and various iterations, or affordable housing. That's a ever larger share of the rent stabilized stock. Certainly during the era where there was decontrol, that units that had been subject to rent stay would exit and other units would add, and the net result was that stayed about the same sea level. But my point is that it's rare, or not rare, but it's a small share of buildings that are not part of one of these other programs that are 100% rent stabilized.
Sorry, I'm just trying to parse that. What could you just rephrase that?
The majority, or most, I would say, of the 100% stabilized buildings are part of another program, such as affordable housing or one of these various tax benefit programs.
About this is there's a stock of 100% affordable that would have come in pre-74, and then I think what you're saying is there's a separate stock of 100% affordable that came in through a different program.
Mm-hmm.
I actually haven't seen that breakdown.
Yeah, I'm curious if that's consistent with our understanding, because, you know, in our Appendix 14, we have the vast majority of buildings under rent stabilization are pre-1974, so they're not a part of one of those programs. And then we have that a large...
Sorry, pre-74 includes many of those programs. That year break doesn't mark things that were sort of originally rent stabilized or rent stabilized as a result of participating in these programs. J51, so almost all older pre-74 buildings, all preservation of affordable housing over multiple housing plans is all pre-74 buildings.
There's a lot of overlap.
Yeah.
Right, so
J51's completely temporary. It phases out
Yeah.
after 30
Uh-huh.
years.
That's correct.
We're looking at
Within that 30 years, it would be, all of the units would be subject to rent stabilization.
Effects throughout.
Yeah.
Don, did you have a last question?
Two quick ones, and I know this is putting it before the cart before the horse a bit, but in terms of the effects on the HSTPA, that data that's going to be coming, is there going to be any discussion of what projected amount of rent-regulated units we would have lost had it not been for the elimination of high vacancy decontrol and things like that? Is that what we would expect from a survey like that?
Those are certainly questions that are on our list to explore.
Okay. And then the second question, which it's, I guess, in conjunction with what Hennis has asked before about the change in, like 2 or 3 bedroom units. I saw here that there was an 11% increase in 3 bedroom units, with Brooklyn having the highest proportion of that. And there's a 5% decrease in 2 bedrooms. So, what's up?
Increasing what?
In the number of 2 bedroom units. And so I guess I'm wondering, are we attributing this to the combining of more units, particularly in Brooklyn, as to why there's just more 3+ bedrooms?
Yeah, so you're pointing to numbers that are available in our report.
Yeah.
So again, we'll flag that, make sure that we send that table number so that all of you can look at the underlying numbers. So what's important to note about those numbers is that this is net change between our 2 survey. When we compare our 2 sort of point estimates, that means it's both additions and losses. So there could have been even more construction or conversion of 3 bedrooms with some that were subdivided, and then the net result is this gain in larger units. So just to clarify what those numbers are measuring. It's not only attributable to any one source, right? There's construction. We've seen a lot of construction over the last several years of new housing, and so there's a distribution of those units. Some of this is the result of subdividing or combining of units. Right, of various kinds, and also conversion from non-residential to residential, and vice versa, right? But there's all of those kinds of things that together are producing this overall shift in the distribution that we reported.
All right. I think that's all of our questions. I cannot thank you enough. This is incredibly helpful and remarkable data. I wish I could say we won't have follow-up questions, but we will have follow-up questions, and thank you in advance for all of your help.
Thank you very much.
All right. Are there any other questions or things we need to cover? If not, I'll ask for a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
Come on,
We are adjourned. Thank you.
Don, you're getting slow. Dude.